It's November 10, 2013, and I'm Betty Bishop interviewing Reverend Emeritus Dorothy Lenz at the First Congregational Church of Ann Arbor. Welcome, Dorothy.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
And we just have some questions. We've been interviewing long-term members of the church in part of our updating of the church history. And I guess to begin with, what year did you become involved first with First Congregational Church?
We came here in 1955.
1955.
And we had come from Denver. My husband was coming to get to the university to get a master's in public health. And we had gone through the worst storms you ever know about. In fact, one time in the middle of Kansas, we were stuck out on the highway, and by some miracle, a snowplow came by and got us. We had to live in a hotel because we had no place to stay. We needed a church.
I can imagine.
Yes, and because we had a 1.5-year-old and a 3.5-year-old, we needed a church that had church school at the same time as the service. And so when we finally did get a place to stay, we checked that out and we went to the church of the denomination that we had been used to. I'm not mentioning it because I'm going to tell a bad story, but a lesson for all of us. We went to the church and we got the children settled, but we couldn't find the sanctuary because we were on a different level. And there was a young man carrying papers, and we asked him how to get to the sanctuary. Now here's his perfect chance to say, stay right here. I have an errand to do, and then I'll come back and take you to the sanctuary. He said, oh, it's over there.
Oh dear.
So we went to the next place on our list, and it was the First Congregational Church. And we neither of us knew about this. I was brought up in Duluth, Minnesota, where there was a Congregational church, but I didn't know anything about it. And you just can't believe it. They welcomed us with open arms. They asked if we'd like the minister to call. We were just surrounded by loving people. In fact, I said to my husband, I'd be embarrassed not to join this church. And are we ever glad we did?
That's wonderful.
This is the perfect church and has been all these years for us.
Who was the minister when you first came here?
Dr. Leonard Parr.
I thought it would have had to be from the dates.
Yeah, and he came to call, and it turned out he was a tea drinker, and since we're tea drinkers, that added to the whole.
So that was another common point, is the thing.
That's right.
And so you've been involved in the church for a very long time, and then you became more involved in the church.
Yes. I want to tell you about what struck us about this church, however.
Please do.
We could not believe, we've been church people all our lives, and whenever we moved, the first thing we did was to find a church, because that's the community. You know, we knew no one here. And you have instant community in a church. In fact, it's been true ever since. I have many, many friends, but you know, the closest and dearest are members of this church. Anyway, we could not believe that we'd found a church where you worked out your own faith and respected what other people worked out and still had close community. This just seems impossible. And furthermore, down the line a little bit, when I was working in the church school, the whole theme of the year was community. We didn't have to do anything about that. We already had community in this church. Absolutely remarkable. And to think we might have joined the other church by mistake. This is a very happy thing for us.
That is great. And so then you mentioned working with the church school, and you did that for a number of years, if I recall.
Yes, I did. You know, I think you should know about the kinds of things that were available when I came.
Yes,
because I wasn't working in the church school, but I immediately started teaching in the church school. And the women's fellowship was very strong in those days. There were circles meeting of women meeting in the daytime and one even at night. And so that was a very wonderful way to get to know people in the church. And in fact, here's another nice thing. When you're new, it's sometimes very difficult to go and break into a group that's been there for ages. But, for example, the people in the night circle, the Ann Bradford circle, called and invited me and said, we'll pick you up and take you there.
How nice.
Which was wonderful. By the way, that's a funny little historical note. We began looking and there never was an Ann Bradford.
Oh.
And so at one point we decided that had been a mistake and we would ask Dr. Parr if we could make this the Parr Circle. However, when one of our people went out to tell him this joyous news, he looked very disturbed. And he said, don't you realize that all the other circles are named after dead people?
Oh,
so we kept the Ann Bradford name.
So you were involved in the church school and in the circles and obviously...
And you know, the Women's Fellowship had a very wonderful thing going where we would meet and there were many women there, a big circle in the Mayflower room, and we passed a book around reading, taking turns reading. And then anyone who had something to say could interrupt, and it was quite lively conversation. And I remember I was chairman of devotions, and my husband made us a lovely little altarpiece, which he hand-carved some growing grape leaves.
Oh, how lovely.
So that this was a sign of the growth of the group. And we had a cloth that stood for service. And then each time we met, we had something that was symbolical of that theme that day. And it was a wonderful group. And when it, as all things do, ceased to be, I thought my life was ruined. But because I was always a part of a discussion group, I thought we're going to have one. And that was the beginning of the Women's Wednesday Discussion Group, which is a beloved thing for many, many people in this church. And by the way, lasted until just maybe 3 years ago when the group was not there anymore. And do you know what happened? This is something wonderful Bob did. He has now a Wednesday morning text breakfast.
Right.
Where we read the text and discuss about it. Well, that's pretty brave.
Yes.
You know, he's getting what his people are asking about and what they're thinking about, and it may not be what he had planned at all, but I think it's a good help to him, and it's a wonderful, wonderful group.
And it's continued in spirit, at least, than
That's
some of
right.
what had been
That's
going
right.
on.
And
is the thing.
how good to, in fact, it was a women's discussion group, but at the end some men were coming. And actually it was one man that saved this because he didn't want to quit. So he and Bob began having lunch together, and you know, you can't really do that. And that was when the text breakfast started.
Okay.
And you know, there are maybe 16 people who come. It's very exciting. Lots of different ideas.
Great. And then I know at some point in all of this development, they got more involved in the church and became one of the ministers. Tell us about that a little
that
bit.
was pretty interesting, and that's one of the kindnesses of this church. At one point in the game, Terry Smith needed to go to Florida to a meeting, and I think it was Joanne Smith's idea. And the idea was, well, why can't Dorothy preach? And so I did. And then maybe the next year, he went away for the whole summer, and who was there? And so then eventually, I, after working many years as director of the church school, became his assistant. And very wonderful, happy times. Learned so much from Terry Smith and now from Bob about how you work in the church.
And when was that about that you started doing that? Do you remember?
I I'm thinking that I preached that sermon maybe in 78.
Okay, because
So it was, you know.
so you continued doing that for quite some time. Then
Yeah.
you were active in the actual ministry of the church.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, I think that's right, because we in the meantime had moved to Coldwater, where my husband had a practice as a cardiologist and internist, and where he died. And that's
Yes.
another tender thing about this church. They welcomed me back. And first of all, I said to Terry, there's no way I can come and do the same thing over with Ralph gone.
Right.
And he said, oh, come and talk about it. And the rest is history. I'm still here.
So you
Yeah.
came back, and
Yeah.
I know by the time I came and got involved in the church in the early 90s, you were very much a part of it, is the thing, and
Yeah,
very involved as the associate minister. And
right. But you know, I loved the church school. We had so many wonderful, happy, creative kinds of things going on in the church school. And it was a very happy time where a lot of new things happened. And I'm loving the new church school with its Palestinian atmosphere, because one of the things we had done, which was a community kind of thing, is the junior high group had made bulletin boards for the younger children. So each door had a bulletin board made with a frame, and then a burlap of different colors. And then they each had their own advertising campaign. Well, now this is a whole different thing. And that's kind of the spirit of this church, I think, that places have been changed. For example, when we came, where the church office is now was just hallway. And there was a library there. But I love the delicate way in which each time there's a new need, people have been able to make use of what's there in a creative way. And that was when that church office was built. And now, coming out of that is the wonderful library and the entryway to Pilgrim Hall. Which,
right, and we keep making adaptations and dealing with change as we need to, is the
That's
thing.
right.
And moving now to the church school, having computers and working with those, so they are keeping up with changes in time as they need to do.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see, because the church was rather conventional at first with classes, as we're all used to, and then we had a year in which we had kind of an open school where we met together and sang and had a lesson, and then children chose which of the activities they were going to do. And now we have a whole new thing going, and each time it's been kind of progressive, I think, that each new thing has been just the right thing for that particular time.
And you've seen kind of a change in senior ministers over time, because you
Yes.
said that the Reverend Leonard Parr was the minister when you first came here.
And then Dr. Luke's.
Right.
And then we had a year in which two lay ministers, Ray Barstow and George Fernhoff, took over. And so we kept the place going.
Oh, yes.
And you know, that was an interesting thing, because when we didn't have an official minister, we were on our own, we could do anything. For example, that was the beginning of dancing girls in the sanctuary, which nobody would have liked. But you can't tell someone who's volunteering and you don't have anyone else, oh no, we can't do that. And a lot of things evolved that way, because it says pretty much for the church, when it's sort of on its own, to be able to bring up new things and appropriate things and things that lasted.
And that's been one of the factors I've seen in this church over the last 20-some years, is just its ability to change and to try new things and to be open to new ideas.
And also to be open to whatever anybody else wants.
Yes.
I think that's a really important thing, because it's an awful chasm to get into in which you say, but you know, that person never works on any of these committees. Well, that's a really exciting thing in this church. Never, I think I've been here 58 years, for heaven's sakes. And never have I heard the minister have to get up and say, well, we really need to start working on some social issues here. It's always been grassroots. Somebody has a wonderful interest and gets excited about it and calls together other people who are excited. That's why we have Circle of Friends. That's why we do Habitat for Humanity, for example.
Why, we just had this morning, I was at the Contemporary Issues Committee's talk about the HIV/AIDS program in Washtenaw County. So we keep up with change.
Yeah, and I think this brings up a very, very important point. This growth and this change that comes out of the grassroots, and the ability of the people to get excited about these things, but not to demand that other people have to do this. You know, over all these years, I found some who just have to come to worship. And to say they're less members than others is a wrong thing. They need to be left alone. Maybe they will come out of this and get very active, but maybe their life needs this quiet, worshipful time, and at least for a while. And this church has been very sensitive to the needs of people. I think this is a real change in the church that we see now, because when I came long ago, I told you there was this wonderful sense of community. There were wonderful things to do, discussion groups, circles, and so forth. There wasn't what we're calling today much mission. And by mission, I don't mean are you saved, but we need to help wherever we can to make your life better. It's not that the church didn't do that, but it was more individuals doing the things that they were interested in,
Rather than the church.
rather than the church doing something. And I think we need a real balance. I want to be sure that we're up to date on the latest thinking in Christian circles, and we're not hanging back saying things that we don't really believe, but they were part of the original dogma. I want us to know what's happening. So I want us to have some learning possibilities. But I think this new mission bit in the church is a wonderful, wonderful addition. I think we're getting these two things together and making a fuller, more helpful and wonderful church.
So, and Dorothy, you then of course we talked about Terry having been here as minister for many years while you were here, and then there came another change.
Yes. And you know, it's again a tribute to the way this church works and to their ability to choose excellent leadership, because we love Bob, and the last sermon Terry and I gave together ended up with now we're ready for the new guy. Well, I guess it's the now guy. And then he came up and greeted us all. And Bob has been remarkable. He never ever required us to do anything, you know, like you better preach this next week. Nor did he ever insist that we couldn't just lean back if we wanted to. And he just came in with such dignity and spent the time, and eventually now his program is really his own, but he never stepped on our feet. He was always appreciative of us and learning from us, and that was a very delicate and wonderful gift to this
And
church.
it was such a wonderfully smooth transition.
Exactly.
Because I remember it well, since I was co-chair of Mary Mostagame of the Board of Deacons at the time this all happened as a thing, and how seamlessly sort of, because you and Terry retired, as I recall, about the same time.
Yes, although we have to go on record as saying I worked a month later.
Thank
because
you.
Bob had signed up for Boundary Waters.
That's right.
And so he said, would I stay? And of course I would. So, but to watch him, there are some churches in town, one in particularly I'm remembering, where the new person in the service told the former pastor to get out and not come back again. So for him to work so, as you say, seamlessly with us has been absolutely amazing.
And the fact that you all have continued to be very involved in the life of the church is the thing. I mean, the Tuesday evening discussions that you and Terry led for a number of years and they have continued is the thing. There have been various new developments.
Yeah, and it just, that doesn't always happen, and to have it happen so easily and with such fun. I'll tell you what's important is a sense of humor. And that sense of humor gets us through an awful lot of things.
That's a very good point,
So.
is the thing. And that might make me come to another thing here. What is something you can think of some notable events and how the church has handled those? And they just gave a couple of suggestions here, things like the assassination of President Kennedy or 9/11 or any other sort of national, international events and how the church responded.
I can't really say much about that, but I do have to tell you that when Kennedy was assassinated, I was at a circle meeting, and somebody came in and brought us the news. And it was an amazing thing to be among caring people. And immediately the group had prayer. And I don't know how that would have been if I had been alone at home, for example. Just that group being there together was a very, very special thing. I don't remember any reports that I heard of people who had to have help from a minister because they were so upset. So I really can't answer that, but I do know being in the bosom of the church when it happened was very important to me and very touching. I'm sure that people, over the years that I've seen it, not so much to me, though occasionally, people with that kind of problem have been able to come to whoever the preacher was at that senior minister at that time was and find counsel and help. And there have been a lot of tough things in the church.
Oh, yes.
And the church people have always followed through on that too. Whatever the minister helped the hurting person to understand. I have just some things to tell about me. The way we were welcomed in the first place, the way I was welcomed back, the many meals people have brought when I've broken something or something. And there's just a wonderful story. There was a couple, she was in great difficulty. She just couldn't do anything. She had to have help. It's a horrible story. They were not church members, but I called the then deaconesses
Yes.
and said, these people need food. And they said, well, they're not members. And I said, I know they're not, but they need food. And the deaconesses graciously brought them food while they needed it. Well, that couple then joined the church and they both became very active. So you not only welcome them in, but you take care of them once they get there.
Because they probably came then because they realized here was a
Exactly.
open, welcoming community who didn't say, oh, well, we won't help you because you aren't on a piece of paper as being a member. Is the thing.
Right. And then, I'm sure that doesn't always happen, but I bet it does mostly when you do something like that for somebody, then that person wants to come back with
Right.
some kind of kindness for
And
you.
even if they may not come back here, maybe they've gone on somewhere else to do it, because I know sometimes we have students as a thing who are only with us for a relatively short time and may not actually join the church. But you may
Exactly.
instill in them some
I
thinking
think that's an important thing to remember.
then they carry on to wherever they next go.
And we have so much coming and going, this being Ann Arbor, that in fact we have a wonderful story because I've told you how important welcoming is. Well, we once had a visiting minister who talked about this and then said, now everybody, just turn to the person next to you, and if you're not acquainted, get acquainted. And I, being a perfect student, of course, turned immediately and said, I'm Dorothy Lenz. And the guy looked at me and said, we've known each other for years. So it can be embarrassing too. So you take a little risk when you do that with people, but it's really important to make people feel as if they're welcome. Know that they're welcome, not just feel as if.
Any particular happy memories or stories you would like to share with us about the church?
I have nothing but happy memories of this church. This might be the time. There are 2 stories, funny stories, touching stories that will always live with me that I don't want ever to get lost. One of them is a little raucous, but you'll have to deal with that. And the first one is about Terry Smith and a time when we had a secretary who was an English major and thought she knew everything about English. But to our great horror, she put in the bulletin a little item, which though, as far as English is thought about, was just fine, but it had a little off-colorness. The morning group I guess it was after the summer or something. Anyway, it was going to start again. And she wrote, it was open to all women, come at 9:30 for friendly intercourse with our minister. Well, it was pretty embarrassing, though she said to the end, it's a perfectly good use of the word. Well, anyway, the first meeting, we didn't really know what to do. Do we laugh about this? Do we ignore it? What do we do? And we're all thinking, we all love Terry and we all have fun with Terry, but is this just going a little too far? He walks in, he walks to the chalkboard, he picks up the chalk, he starts numbering 1, 2, 3, and turns to us and says, the only fair way we can do this is for you to sign up. The sweet story has to do with the church school. It was our habit for many years to plant grass seed when we were talking about growing things and so forth, because it grows so fast. Yes. By the next time. Well, Holly Porter was doing that with the group. And she did a very nice thing. Instead of the kids taking them home, she brought, these were pie plates, she brought them up and put them on the Easter breakfast tables. And she had dyed eggs, which I think they had dyed, and little bunnies. And it was charming. And then when dinner was over, or breakfast, she was just going to throw them away. And a man in the church asked her what she was going to do, and she said, oh, just throw it. He said, I have a cat at home that's an indoor cat, and I bet that cat would love that grass around. And she said, sure, take what you want. And then she threw the rest away. Well, the next Sunday, the children came and they wanted their grass.
Oh dear.
And Holly said, oh, I'm so sorry. I did throw it out, but I want to tell you something that'll make you feel better about it. And she told about the grass for the cat. And this one little boy, you couldn't have thought this up if you tried. The sweet little boy comes up to her and says, was it a very old couple that wanted this grass? And Holly said, well, he was older. They weren't really, really old. Why do you ask? And the little boy said, I have heard that old people like to sit around and watch the grass grow. Now, isn't that an adult couldn't have done that.
No.
But it was. Let me see, there was something I was thinking about. I'm really into this importance of freedom in the church. And sometimes it crops up in odd ways. For example, this was way before you came, Betty, but one of the things we were doing was asking that all committee and board members come together on the same night, and we met in the chapel and had a little worship service, and then we went. But we soon realized that we needed more organization and more ability to know what the other group was doing so that we could all work together. And so a church council was suggested. Well, it seemed logical. We needed something to bring these groups together. But at the very last moment, at the meeting to decide what to do, a very prominent person in the church got up and gave an impassioned speech against having such a thing. It was not the open freedom of Congregationalism. And the congregation has the last word, otherwise we would not be Congregationalists, and this was a wrong thing. I wasn't sure what was the best thing to do, but for some reason I stood up and said, you know, we've got to find something to solve our problem. Why don't we try this for a while? And if it doesn't work, we can meet again, and we're the congregation, we can get rid of it. And you know what's happened.
And it has continued ever
does.
since.
But I have a real thing about freedom, and I think we have to be careful. First of all, I would trust that this church would never get involved with an overgroup, that we own our property, we call our own minister, we set up our own situation. It's expensive and difficult, and we have none of the old, very, very rich families that could keep the church going financially. So it's hard. But to me, it's very important that nobody tell us how we have to believe, or who we have to call, or what kind of person we have to call, or any of those things. And it also occurs to me that we have to watch for that within our situation too, because a church council could take over. It has not, thank goodness, but it could, and take away the freedom. And there is one sample I have in which it happened, and it should never have happened. And that's our beautiful motto, that we are a beacon. And it came out of the council, and it's beautiful and wonderful, but we never voted on it. So essentially, it's the council's motto and not ours. And I think that's an important thing to keep watching, because the people who refused to join the United Church of Christ were really strong Congregationalists. But as years go by, that strongness doesn't necessarily have to keep going. And to me, it's very important that we keep this freedom and this way of making up our own minds and respecting what the others have written up. Thought up, not written. Oh,
Right.
maybe written up. Sometimes they do.
Sometimes both, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, just a couple of other things here, I think. What's the biggest change you've seen in the church in the 50-some years you've been coming here?
Yeah. I think we talked about that a little while ago, and that is this new mission emphasis.
Right. I thought that was probably what you were going to say.
I think that's what I see, and what I hope will always keep both elements going. It's interesting because we've had some very different leaders, but the congregation has always held to this ability to work out its own ideas and respect other people's
And
ideas.
I think that's something that most of us in the church value very greatly.
Yes.
It's the thing that the church gives people that freedom and flexibility to do that we are not tied as some other Protestant churches are to a specific doctrine or
creed
or dogma or whatever you wish to call it.
And I think the key there is also that not only do we make up our own minds, but we respect the
Yes.
thoughts of the other people.
How do you see the churches developing in the future? What do you see is coming?
I hope we'll keep on this course, that we keep the freedom idea and the freedom reality, and that we continue this twofold growth, the reaching out group and the reaching within, so that we're growing. We certainly get good sermons to keep us on this, But unless you keep on it, you can get too involved with the outgoing things and forget that, they need to come from somewhere. And I see this church having made remarkable steps in this direction in the right time. When I first came to church to do Habitat for Humanity, which didn't even exist then, it wouldn't be churchy. But eventually the time came. And that's important. This church seems to know what to do with the time. And I think it's because we all care so much for each other.
I think you've probably hit on the very important points of this, and I want to thank you so much for sharing all of this with us.
Well, I'm glad to do it, and I'm coming to bring you something that you may already have, but one of the things long ago in the church school was the 200th birthday of the man, Robert Rakes, who started the church school. And he started it by caring for orphans on the street who had nothing, and gave them not only shelter and food, but some religious information. And we had a big celebration in the church, big celebration. And as one of the things we did, we asked the kids if they would write a song, which they did. It's just amazing how it worked out. Lynn Bodum, Lois Wilson, and I got together with the kids from first grade up. The little ones didn't take part, of course. They had their own celebration, but the song was written by the older children. They told us what ideas they wanted in the song, and then we helped them with the rhyming, so the song has strength and purpose to it. And then the children wrote music to go with this. Couldn't have done it with me, but Lois Wilson was a very musical person. And she was able to take the children's thoughts. And eventually, on a trip to England, I took a tape of our children singing the song to Robert Rakes' church in Gloucester, England, in the pouring rain, by the way. That man from Gloucester who went out and was up to his middle in rain. You can believe it. I hope it's still there, but anyway, it was a wonderful, exciting time for us. And actually that had a little crossover because we had visiting people from England who had little children in the church school, and they took the tape back for us.
Great.
And I was eventually able to go to the church and say, this is so exciting that I'm seeing this. And I didn't get to see anybody but the custodian, who was called a warder, could that be? Or
yes.
A warden or a warder. And she didn't know about it, but she was going to check on it. And I don't know if you have that, but I brought you the words. And I think if we got together with Lois, we could get the music, which ought to be there too.
That would be lovely.
Because this was a remarkable thing the kids did, and they were all so excited about it.
I'm not aware of our having that in the history room. It's possible we do, but it's nothing I have come across yet.
I did a very bad thing about history. Each year when I directed the church school, we had a theme, and we made a scrapbook, and they were wonderful. But we didn't identify the children. And so the historian refused them, and they just got lost. But that's too bad, because it would have been wonderful history.
Yes.
Even if we didn't know the names of the children, somebody would. So anyway, but I want you to take this, and I'll try to get some music.
Okay, that's wonderful.
So I want to say one other thing.
Of course.
I've got a lot of other things to say. When I came here, the church was much as it is now as far as the building is concerned.
That's right.
But I have two bits about what it used to be. First of all, there used to be a little kitchen downstairs in what's now the church school. I don't know, there was a dumbwaiter that went from it to the Mayflower room. I don't know if that still exists. But it turned, by the time I got there, they weren't using it as a kitchen, but it was used as a storage room for the church school. But the closest I ever got to the original sanctuary came one day when workmen were stopping another leak in the church that had taken the walls and was
Yes.
bubbling. And I was working away, and one of the guys came and said, "You've got to come and see this." They had uncovered up over the wainscoting about that much of colored stenciling
Oh my.
that once surrounded the church. And there was a lot of color in the church, and verses, and incidentally a clock in the back so nobody would talk too long. But anyway, there was no way that they could save that but for me to get to see that and stand for a minute and give thanks that the balcony had been taken down and the stained glass windows up. Beauty has happened along the way too.
Right.
And I guess one of the things that I have loved to do is do guided tours of the church inside and out. And one of the things that people don't notice, particularly outside, is that at the end of the driveway, that side of the building is just concrete blocks. It's not the beautiful fieldstone, because eventually it was hoped to build another building to be a parish hall or church school building or something. And its head raised again some years ago, but it just never came to be.
Yes, I remember there was some discussion of that soon after I came here, and I think we had some drawings or something, but it never got beyond that.
It was so much money, and we just didn't. The church school rises and falls. In those early days, there were like 200 kids in the church school, and that was a pretty exciting time. But anyway, people are still thinking about what are the ways we can make this work better. And if you ever had a motto, that's got to be it. So it's been my real joy to be in this church, and I've forgotten a lot of things I wanted to tell you, but they're all good.
It's been delightful doing this, and who knows, we may come back and ask you about some of those other things at some future point.
I would be glad to talk about anything, and thank you, Ryan, for going through all the difficulties of getting the pieces of equipment together and to hold it steady during this event. I hope it's steady and that I'm not looking like this.
No, I think it's done fine.
It looks great.
Thank you so much, Ryan.
Yeah, I appreciate it.